All right, I'll step out, but like I said, if anyone needs anything, just pop it in the chat.
Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone. I'm glad we have so many people coming out for this talk and enthusiastic about historic burying grounds, as many of you are. I'm going to give a little introduction here because this talk was my bright idea. And then I roped Craig and Adeena into it, who they enthusiastically agreed to collaborate, is how I should put it. So we're all very interested in sharing information about the old burying ground and talking to other people who are enthusiastic as well. We have, if we can advance the slide, give people a little bit of a sense. If you're not familiar with where the old burying ground, St. Paul's Cemetery, is located in downtown Halifax, there's a little bit of a map to help you get a sense of where it is. And it is right down in the center of downtown Halifax. And Kyle has given us a little bit of an introduction, but we are all involved in the Old Burying Ground Foundation Board. Adeena Fox is a graduate student in Atlantic Canada Studies at St. Mary's University. She also completed her honors in anthropology at SMU as well. And she's been on the board of the Old Burying Ground Foundation since 2022. Craig Ferguson is a writer and documentary TV producer. He is also the author of Dead in Halifax, Stories of Adventure, Scandal, Heartache, and Heroism, and the creator of the Dead in Halifax Twitter account, which is quite popular. Myself, I'm Vanessa Smith. I'm the Assistant Curator of Archaeology at the Nova Scotia Museum, and I sit on the board as the NSM advisor. I am interested in mortuary archaeology and commemoration broadly, as well as research into early colonial Halifax. We've basically broken up the talk into sections based on our areas of interest and expertise. Adeena is going to be covering the history and the development of the old burying ground. Craig is going to be looking at broadly who's buried in the old burying ground, some demographic information, as well as the gravestone carvers and carving traditions that we can still see in the burying ground. And I'm going to be looking at the archaeological work that's been conducted at the old burying ground. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adeena to start us off with some history.
Thanks, Vanessa. So just jumping right into it, we have a nice map here that I got from Dr. Jonathan Fowler of the early settlement of Halifax. So of course, Halifax was founded on June 21st, 1749. And on the voyage over, of course, there were people that had died and they needed to establish a cemetery, a place where they could bury these individuals. So the old burying ground was established just outside of the town wall. And there was originally 5 forts that surrounded the settlement. So I put a couple arrows here on the screen. So the top arrow is actually pointing at where the old burying ground is located. And then just below that, you'll see there's actually a footprint there for Horseman's Fort. So that fort essentially was located in the basically just over from the intersection of Spring Garden and Barrington Street. So right beside the little glebe house that's by the Basilica and kind of going in underneath the Maritime Center. And very early on, it's important to note that the cemetery was non-denominational. So the first 30 years of use, everyone was buried there. So the rich, the poor, there wasn't any separation that was happening of individuals during this time. So in the beginning, there weren't any burial fees that were charged towards the old burying ground because the land wasn't actually owned by St. Paul's until 1793. So when St. Paul's took over the land in 1793, they were able to start charging for burial fees and everything. Before that, they were doing all of the record keeping and keeping track of who was buried there and everything. But following them taking over the land, they were able to keep those records and everything in the church and actually charge for the fees associated with the burials. So I just wanted to show a watercolor painting that's from Alexander Mercer in September of 1840. So this is actually an earlier source that we actually get to see what the downtown area looked like before photography existed. And so you can see that this is basically in front of St. Matthew's Church, looking across the street. So in the background, you can see St. Mary's Basilica and the glee posts. And actually around the old burying ground at this time is this 8-foot high stone wall. So there's these very early perceptions of death. People don't want to be looking at the old burying ground. They don't want to see burials taking place. Cemeteries are associated with being dirty, contaminated. So this wall is surrounding the cemetery for quite a few years. And it's also believed at this time that the cemetery was in quite a state of neglect, which I will follow up with here. So in proximity to the St. Paul's burial ground, there's actually 3 or 4 other cemeteries, and Craig's actually going to talk more about that after. But I think it's important to note that there's a lot of other burying grounds right across the street from St. Paul's. And there was a law that was passed in 1843 where all of these cemeteries were closed. So they were really overcrowded. There, of course, have been a number of epidemics. There was just no space left. They didn't want to bury anyone else there. So the city opened up cemeteries outside of the immediate downtown area. So we see Camp Hill Cemetery open and Holy Cross Cemetery. And so there's some speculations, of course, of when the last burials took place in these immediate downtown areas. But supposedly the last burial for the old burying ground was in 1845, but that's all up to a matter of debate. And so following these closures of the downtown cemeteries, there's another long period of neglect. The cemetery is just sitting there from 1843 until the 1860s. So in this time, there are a lot of meetings that start to come about. People are noticing that, we need to do something, like the cemetery is just sitting there. What can we do? Who are the important players that can help get people motivated to be interested in restoring the cemetery? So I had found this newspaper clipping a couple of years ago from the Acadian Recorder in 1860, and it just kind of lays out the different people that really wanted to see the cemetery be restored, and just what kind of things they could do to get people interested in the site again. And this is just another example of what kind of community engagement we're seeing with the site. And this was published in 1862. So that was actually after the Wellsford Parker Monument was erected. So this photo is from July 17th, 1860. So this is a public monument that is in memory of Major Augustus Wellsford and Captain William Parker. They were 2 Nova Scotians who fought in the Crimean War, and they died in 1855. And this monument's really important because it's a very rare pre-Confederation war memorial for the Crimean War. So from 1860 up to 1865, we have some different repairs going on. So I found a photograph that shows once the stone wall had been removed, we're getting this nice iron fence that's put around a much significantly lower stone wall. And then we go another 100 years and the cemetery just sort of sits again. We have some interest during this time. There's a rural cemetery movement that's happening in Mount Auburn in Boston, where people start to perceive cemeteries as parks. They really want to spruce them up. They want to be able to walk through them, enjoy them. And so that's that key period from the 1860s that you're seeing, like the fence going in. People are really kind of interested in the cemetery. There's less perceptions of contamination, but for some reason, it's still the cemetery sits for almost 100 years. And then in 1958, the Downtown Merchants Association proposed the idea of putting a parking lot over the cemetery. So they were like, hey, this is some prime real estate. It's not getting used. Why don't we use this as a parking lot? And there was so much backlash. People were writing into the paper being like, hey, you can't do this. This is a significant site. There's a lot of significant people that are buried here, the early founders of the city. So they get a lot of backlash. And obviously, the site does not become a parking lot. And then we go into the 1980s where this is again where we go from 1958 to the 1980s. There's not really a lot happening. They're kind of trying to figure out who should take charge and who should fix up the site. And then we have the development of the Old Burying Ground Foundation. So the Old Burying Ground Foundation was established in 1987. It consists of a board of directors, and there's also a chairman, a secretary, a treasurer, and directors. And Vanessa is the member from the museum that sits on as our advisor. So the mission statement for the Old Burying Ground Foundation is just to preserve the site, to raise funds, to maintain any sort of, like, we do maintenance in terms of cutting back tree branches. We work with Dalhousie to have the sites secure when it's open from May to October. We also have some tour guides that are there during the summer months to interact with the tourists and everything that are coming in. And the site is actually has 3 heritage designations. So it's a municipal heritage site in 1986. It's a provincial heritage property in 1988. And it's also a National Historic Site, which was designated in 1991. And this is actually the first cemetery in Canada that received this designation. So you just get a sense of, as you listen to Craig and Vanessa speak about the site, what sort of elements of the cemetery make it significant, and why it's still here today. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Craig.
Okay, thank you, Adeena. So yeah, there are about 10,000 to 12,000 estimated burials in the old burying ground, and the records are incomplete, and the estimates vary. There's about 1,200 markers remaining, and that includes headstones, footstones, ledger stones. You can see one in the right of the image there. That's a sort of horizontal gravestones that cover the entire plot. And what people sometimes call like a box tomb, which is the same idea, but more of a shoebox shape. And sometimes people think people were buried in those, but they were not. It's just a style of gravestone that people would choose. And I think a larger one is an indication of some sort of wealth and prestige. It was the common burying ground for all religions and social classes until the foundation of a lost Jewish cemetery circa 1750, the poorhouse burying ground, which is the lawn of the former library. It's underneath the former library site. The parking lot across the street there next to the basilica is the location of St. Peter's Catholic Cemetery, which opened in 1784, and the Methodist burying ground that opened at what's now St. David's Church above Pizza Corner. It opened in 1793. Independent researcher Todd Scott, who I see in the audience this evening, has used the parish records to identify the burials of 4 Mi'kmaq people and 167 Black people in the old burying ground, and no markers remain for those individuals, whether they had markers in the first place and they were lost, or whether the graves were unmarked. No markers remain for those folks. Move on to the next slide, please. So just to give you an example of, the old burying ground is a great place to talk about the history of Halifax and early Halifax. You can look at significant events and find the people, the principles from those events in the old burying ground. So for example, the 1761 Peace and Friendship Treaty, 3 signatories are buried in the OBG, including Chief Francis Muse of Le Havre, Lieutenant Governor Jonathan Belcher, and Jonathan Binney, who is a local judge and political figure and lawyer. And the Catholic priest Pierre Maillard, who negotiated and witnessed the treaty. He was buried at the old burying ground, was later moved to St. Peter's when it opened. And there was a hatchet buried at the signing of the treaty, and it's would have been just outside the old burying ground property in what is now sort of the front lawn area of the old courthouse. Moving on to the next slide, there are plenty of military burials. I guess these loyalists shouldn't have really fallen under military burials, but another significant event is the American Revolution and the loyalists who moved to Nova Scotia. There were 30 from Boston, 9 from New York, and one Boston patriot, Benjamin Kent, who was the Attorney General of Massachusetts. He won the first case against slavery in the US, and he was the one who encouraged Founding Fathers John Adams to draft the Declaration of Independence. There are 8 burials from the War of 1812, including most famously Major General Robert Ross. You are looking at the inscription for his gravestone that recounts in full that he was the British general who led troops into Washington, stormed the Capitol, ordered the burning of the White House. He never set foot in Halifax when he was alive, but he was killed, I believe, on his way to the Battle of Baltimore, and he was pickled in rum and shipped to the closest British port, which was Halifax, Nova Scotia at the time. And 2 crewmen from the HMS Shannon, which famously captured the American ship Chesapeake. 2 crewmen remain buried in the old burying ground. The captain of the Chesapeake was briefly buried in the old burying ground and was moved a couple times before he wound up in Trinity Churchyard in New York. There are 4 burials from the Battle of Waterloo, 4 people who were killed in action in the French Revolutionary War, and their burials were overseen by Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent, and not listed on here. There's also burials from people who were present at Lewisburg and the Plains of Abraham. So quite a lot of military history there. But not just, we'll move on to the next slide, not just military people. We have the image here is the gravestone of Robert Nesbitt, who was a blacksmith. And, you know, politicians, merchants, sea captains, a lot of blacksmiths I've noticed, and at least one midwife, Anne Scott, and her inscription says that she will be deeply missed by the people of Halifax. Moving on to the next slide, we can look at some of the remaining stones here. So it is, if not the largest surviving collection of 18th century mortuary in English Canada, among the largest surviving collections. And so, as I mentioned before, that includes headstones, footstones, and box tombs. And some of the stones once had iron surrounds, and those have been lost to time. The earliest remaining stone is a 1752 stone of a child of Malachi Salter, and it was actually discovered in the course of work in the OBG. It had laid face down, sunk into the ground, and been covered, you know, sod had grown over it. So it was only discovered or rediscovered in the 20th century. But these oldest stones, including the one pictured here, which I believe is a stone of John Ferguson, no relation. In this gravestone as well. Yes, sorry, this gravestone, thank you, of Jonathan Ferguson is a slate stone from Massachusetts, and a lot of the very earliest stones, including the Salter stone, are made of this slate and come from carvers in the Boston area who, you know, the people are able to identify individual carvers through like eccentricities, like just specific designs they used or ways they made certain sorts of letters. Moving on to the next slide, we talk about some notable local carvers. So a lot of the research on this is done by a board member and former curator at the Nova Scotia Museum, Deborah Trask. A lot of you will know Deborah, and hardly there isn't anyone who knows more about gravestones in Nova Scotia than Deborah. What the image you're looking at is the grave for Jenny Best, and it is from the 1770s, and it was carved by a carver who Deborah calls the Halifax carver. She's never been able to identify him definitively. She thinks maybe he was a stonemason who worked down at the dockyards. And what's distinctive about his gravestones are these very sort of eccentric outlines that they have, and these sort of shallow carvings or sort of simple carvings, sorry, of the face. The next prominent carver who arrives on the scene is James Hay. And do we have a James Hay slide on the next slide, I think? So on the left is James Hay's gravestone for Robert Campbell. And this is actually the earliest gravestone that we know that we have from James Hay. James Hay arrived from Scotland, and we know that because he took out an ad at the time. And he took over, it seems that he took over the carving business from the Halifax carver. There's no overlap between the two carvers. And in fact, because some of James Hay's early stones have the eccentric outline that we associate with the Halifax carver, we think that he might have bought the stock of blank stones from the Halifax carver and kind of taken over his practice. And another thing that led Deborah to suspect that is that the Halifax carver was working a lot with Halifax ironstone, and it has a tendency to rust. And one way to stop that is to coat it with this sort of black carbon coating. We're not exactly sure what it is, but James Hay also started doing that right away. And Deborah believes that the Halifax carver showed him how to do it. You know, that there was sort of possibly some meeting and some transfer of this information from one to the other. On the right-hand side of your screen, this is the stone for Alice Wells. And it is carved by Abraham Seaman, who was a loyalist who settled in what's now Wolfville. And there's only 5 stones by him in the only 5 gravestones by him in the old burying ground, and they're all for people with surnames from planter, like Horton planter families, like in Horton Township, which is now Wolfville. Which makes sense because he was living there. So people, presumably the family of the people, even though the people who died and were buried in Halifax, their surnames match with families from the Horton area. Moving on to the next slide. So we saw a death's head earlier. That's the skull with wings, and those slate stones, that's the most common motif on those slate stones that come from the Boston area. Hay brought some iconography from Scotland. You see these faces with the wings. A lot of his gravestones will also feature things like skulls and hourglasses turned on their sides and crossbones, and sometimes sort of like 3 or 4 of those things all in once. The Robert Nesbitt stone with the skull and crossbones we saw earlier was also a Hay stone. And it's very easy to see when you look at Scottish gravestones from just a little bit earlier in the 18th century, it's very easy to see that the influence and how Hay's training in Scotland is reflected in those stones. Move on to the next slide. Here's an example actually of this, of a Hay stone with all 3. So that's a skull on the left, what they kind of call the soul effigy, this kind of angel or cherub head with the wings. The hourglass turned outside, and the crossbones. And there's kind of a folksy charm to these, but these are really quite complicated carvings, and you can see the fancy border along the side. And presumably people paid more for the fancier stones. But there's also like a lot of Deborah speculated there's kind of a background treatment in the background of the deeper carved areas at the top, and that is an attempt to expose more of the stone to oxygen so that it hardens more. And it's just interesting to see how these carvers, hundreds of years ago, were solving the material problems as they worked with these local stones. Next slide, please. This is sort of one of the most celebrated Hay's carvings in the old burying ground. You're looking at the east side on the left and the west side on the right of the stone for Mary Bulkley and her daughter. And Mary Bulkley's husband was the colonial secretary. Their house, you can go have a beer in their house because they lived in what is now the Carlton on the corner of Argyle and Prince downtown. But it's a full iconographic program here. On the left, you have Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. There's a little sun up in the corner. You can see the tree with the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, the serpent wrapped around it. On the other side, we have this, the sort of promise of resurrection here with Gabriel blowing the trumpet and the dead skeleton laying at the bottom and the person sitting up to be crowned. And this is certainly the most complicated of the Hay carvings in the OBG, but this style of stone, the Adam and Eve stone, they call them in Scotland, on the left, isn't common, but there's like maybe 25 18th century Adam and Eve stones remaining in Scotland, and you can definitely see the influence is very clear. And hardly any of them known to exist in North America, but there was another one in the Catholic cemetery, St. Peter's, which is now covered over with the parking lot. Moving on to the next slide. We very quickly here, we're looking at, this shows sort of perhaps a change in people's tastes over time. These are two sides of the same stone from the women in the Gray family. And on the left, you see this very typical Hay carved stone. And with this sort of typical message, here lieth interred the body of Agnes Gray, right? So very matter of fact about there is a dead person below. But just, a few years later, we have this much more allegorical approach, right? In memory of Jane, the wife of Andrew Gray. And, we have sort of a difference in the taste of the iconography, where it's very concerned with the bodily signs of death, the crossed bones, the skull on the left. On the right, we have the Roman urn with the willow weeping over it, and which reflects sort of an interest in neoclassical aesthetics at the time. And so does you can see that it doesn't say that she died, it says obit. It uses the Latin, and it uses the combined A and E for age as well, sort of reflecting just a change in taste, perhaps away from this sort of bodily physical reminder of death, into a sort of more allegorical and neoclassical motif. Vanessa.
Okay, I was on mute there, and now I'm back. If we can just take it back to the map slide, Adeena, thank you. Okay, I'm the archaeology section, and as well as those municipal, provincial, and federal heritage designations that Adeena had mentioned, the old burying ground is also designated by the Borden site number BDCV 91. Archaeological sites across the country are registered using this alphanumeric Borden system. So this is the 91st site registered in this Borden block, and which is primarily downtown Halifax. So it's with many other sites around it. On to the next slide. Looking at the archaeology, you can see here that various archaeological investigations have taken place at the old burying ground over the years. Most have been specifically associated with improvements and restoration projects that were taking place within specific sections of the old burying ground, as opposed to a broader site-wide study. There's also been permit projects that were working in the provincial courthouse parking lot, an area that immediately borders the old modern day old burying ground perimeter to the west. And given the sometimes shifting and imprecise nature of early mapping, these projects necessarily proceeded with an awareness that burials could be encountered in the parking lot as well, but fortunately none were. Next slide, please. The first permitted archaeological work at the old burying ground took place in 1989. Both the preliminary and supplementary reports relate to work around the Welsford Parker Monument that you heard about earlier in the talk during its restoration. This project was conducted by St. Mary's archaeology professor Steve Davis. The preliminary testing was looking specifically for burials in close proximity to the Welsford Parker monument that would be disturbed as the restoration was being carried out. You can see in the site map that 3 trenches were placed to the west, the south, and the east of the monument. North is to the right of the screen in this case. The graves to the north of the monument were thought to have been completely destroyed during the monument's construction. As we heard, the Welsford Parker Monument was constructed in 1860 after the site had been closed to burials. And during the archaeological work around the monument, it became apparent that existing burials had indeed been disturbed when the monument was constructed and grave markers moved during the construction. Can go to the next slide. During the course of the testing, as well as during the monitoring phase of the permit, no in situ graves were found, only evidence of disturbed burials and gravestone fragments mixed with construction debris. And here you can see some of the recovered fragments, both with a winged cherub motif or soul effigy. Not a lot of information on the stones to tie them to a particular burial, unfortunately, but we can see the artwork at any rate. Next slide, please. Moving ahead in time to 2018, this project was a Category B research permit conducted by Jonathan Fowler with St. Mary's students and volunteers to run an electromagnetic induction survey of the entire site using the EM38B, which is the instrument you can see in these pictures, as well as a selective survey of the open area in the south of the old burying ground using ground penetrating radar. And this permit also covered work to update mapping of the headstones and monuments within the graveyard. The EM38B offers a form of non-invasive testing, and it's a reasonably small and maneuverable instrument. You can see Jonathan moving between the headstones in the slide here. And therefore, in some ways, it's ideal for working in burial settings, but the instrument is challenged by the presence of metal objects. In the case of the old burying ground, we have a metal fence, we have metal benches, we have interpretive signage with metal posts. So that was part of the challenge of this work. Moving to the next slide. We see the GPR, ground penetrating radar survey, looked at an area around 10 by 10 meters in the south of the site, where the ground is curiously empty of headstones compared to the density of markers you see elsewhere in the site. And so the results of the survey are up on the screen. The images you're seeing show evidence of an earlier pathway through the graveyard that we don't see anymore. You're looking at 20 centimeters, 40 centimeters, and 60 centimeters below surface depth. And there's also evidence of some returns that might be unmarked burials that requires a little bit more investigation. And again, this was a relatively limited size survey, but further investigation, surveying a larger section of the open section is a possibility that's currently being considered. So fingers crossed on that we can get a bit more information with another survey. Next slide. So this 2019 permit was for exploratory testing on the interior sections of the northeast and west walls of the site to assess the condition of the walls, particularly. Work was conducted by Courtney Glenn of Davis McIntyre and Associates. Test pit number 1 on the east end of the north wall, sort of where they're situated in the photo you're seeing there, near the corner of Spring Garden and Barrington, is a noteworthy section of this permit report. This section of Spring Garden Road was widened in 1948, and they pushed back that northern wall of the old burying ground to accommodate this wider Spring Garden Road and to accommodate trolley cars turning onto Barrington Street. So they contracted the footprint of the old burying ground at that point. And in this corner, archaeologists were seeing significant signs of disturbance in keeping with this intervention, but also noted the outline of the head of an intact coffin, together with flakes of what looked to be tin that could be associated with the tin plating on coffin hardware, very close to the fence. So an important takeaway from this report is the highlighting that burials should be expected at least 60 to 70 centimeters from the wall at the north side. So that's something to keep in mind as future work takes place in the old burying ground. Next slide, please. So here we have, there's 3 permits that all relate to restoration work around the south wall of the old burying ground. The main body of work, A2023 NS 020, was conducted by Laura DeBoer for Davis McIntyre and Associates. And this covered monitoring and mitigation work during the replacement of the south wall at the old burying ground. During the work, disinterred human remains were encountered in 4 locations along the south wall, with much of the skeletal material being found on the south side of the wall, which is the exterior face of the wall that sits on the property currently part of the adjacent Dalhousie campus and not within the old burying ground itself. And these represent disturbed burials that had been redeposited within the builder's trench of when the wall was constructed. They also saw a possible coffin handle and one possible in situ coffin bottom and one possible grave shaft were also located again on the south side of the wall. So this is a particularly sensitive part of the site. In the 1950s, a strip of land from the south of the old burying ground was sold to the province by St. Paul's Church. The land is now part of that Dalhousie Sexton campus property and extends as far south as the opposite side of, there's a short run of street that comes in off Barrington Street called DeCosta Row. So the former old burying ground footprint extended to the south side, the opposite side of that from the old burying ground. And while burials were meant to have been moved as part of the agreement of sale, archaeological evidence is suggesting that they were not. This project highlights the need for ongoing archaeological oversight, not only within the old burying ground, but any excavation or ground disturbance taking place immediately south of the old burying ground on that Dal property. This work also demonstrates the importance and necessity of having a well-planned and thorough human remains protocol in advance of work around the old burying ground and indeed around any historical burying ground. This is important. In this case, the archaeologists anticipated the strong likelihood of encountering human remains in this location because they did a lot of background research. And when this did in fact occur, their protocols provided clear next steps for how to proceed and the best practices for appropriate and respectful treatment of the remains. So these people that were found in the south, portions of people that were found with the south wall work the remains were examined, they were documented, and then when it was possible, they were reinterred. They were buried in a container with a copper plate noting the date that they were reburied. Their location of reburial was mapped and additionally marked by buried yellow flagging tape to prevent future disturbance. So let's not dig up these people again. Next slide. As well as the disturbed burials, the archaeologists also uncovered fragments of dressed stone and this partial grave marker. The text reads, you can probably see that pretty clearly, but born March 22nd, 1821, died December 16th, 1822, aged 1 year, 8 months, and 24 days. Unfortunately, we're not seeing in the burial records a person to tie to these set of dates, but hopefully future research may turn that up. But it's not known who the stone belongs to at this time. Next slide, please. So that is the extent of the archaeological work that has thus far taken place in the old burying ground. When we were planning this talk, we knew we had these 3 sections that we wanted to bring to you, but we are also very big enthusiasts about the graveyard, about the old burying ground ourselves, and we all have stories and stones that we particularly like amongst the various options in the graveyard. So we decided that for this section of the talk, we'd each pick 2 stones that were appealing to us and tell a little bit about the people and the stones that we'd selected. So it was very hard to choose for me. There was such a wealth of options. And so I decided to pick one that was visually interesting, as well as one that told an interesting story about lives in early Halifax. So next slide, please. My first stone was for Abner Stoll, who died in 26th of June, 1821, age 35. And this sandstone monument is incredibly eye-catching because it is just chock-a-block full of Masonic imagery all over the surface, which is not surprising as it was erected by Stoll's Masonic Lodge brothers for him when he passed away. And so among the symbols that we have here, hopefully you can see it relatively clearly on your screen, we have the Bible, we have square and compass, we have 2 pillars of King Solomon's temple, we have the eye of God, we have 7 stars for the number of needed to make a perfect lodge, we have a ladder representing advancement through Masonic knowledge, we have a keystone with letters that are an acronym for part of Masonic mythology. We have that little curious Y shape down in the sort of the bottom corner representing the Pythagorean theorem, something near and dear to all archaeologists' hearts. We also have an ark, we have a flaming lamp, we have an anchor, we have a winged hourglass, we've got it all. So this stone is also interesting because of the prominence of the carver's name. You can see it there right down at the bottom, D. Kinnear, David Kinnear. And unlike other stones where the carver's name is, if it's there at all, is very small, right down in the sod level, this one seems very prominent. So that's interesting. We don't know a great deal about Abner himself. His death notice in the Acadian Recorder only notes his name and his age. St. Paul's burial records indicates that he lived on Lower Water Street. Alan Marble's wonderful Deaths, Burials, and Probates of Nova Scotians tells us that there's also a record for some earlier Stoll burials in the old burying ground, including a number of children, Abner C., Catherine, and Mary, who are all his children. But we don't currently have a stone for them. And one online genealogy site indicated that Abner Stoll was born in 1786 in Massachusetts, and that when he died, his wife, Mary Lindsay, and their surviving children returned to Boston. So this is a very, very noticeable stone in the old burying ground. So that's why I picked that one. My next stone, advance the slides, is a bit plainer. And as I said at the beginning of the talk, I'm interested in early colonial Halifax, and I also have research interests in the ways that people commemorate their departed loved ones, particularly if their choices around commemoration are a little bit non-standard. They run contrary to fashion or expected forms of memorial. And this very sturdy text-only gravestone for Janet Glenn and 2 children, who are likely her grandchildren, follows in some ways the expected pattern that women and children tend to get memorials raised by men who often had the financial stability and resources to commission such a monument, as opposed to women don't necessarily have enough free cash to raise a stone for their departed husbands all that often. However, in this case, this one is unusual in a number of ways. You'll see there's an inscription that is partly in Scots language, or at least pulls words from Scots. And apologies to anyone who is a Scots language speaker, because I am going to not give this a good go, but it says, "Stranger, whether has disease or medical omission clad maist in their last claith." And claith is a Scots word meaning cloth, referencing the winding cloth or sheet that a body would be buried in. And while it seems like this inscription might be from a line from a longer text, an exact match cannot be located. Closest reference we have maybe to a Robert Burns poem, Death and Dr. Hornbrook. This poem was written in Scots language, and it satirizes the medical profession and includes the line that Hornbrook's skill has clad a score in their last claith. So there's a lot of similarities there. And it's curious as well, because the phrase is, one reading definitely could be that this is an enduring indictment in stone against the medical profession and an error that was made that meant the death of one or more of the people buried in this monument. It's also not particularly common to list the specific ailments that befell the deceased. But we see here that the children died of, and again, probably butchering this pronunciation, Senanche trachealis for William and Senanche malign for Alexander. Slightly different spellings, but Senanche trachealis is croup, and Senanche malign is putrid sore throat. St. Paul's, again, their burial records note the deaths of Janet Glenn, 77, of Argyle Street, as well as William Glenn and Alexander Glenn. There is another entry, there's also an entry for another William Glenn, also of Argyle Street, on the 27th of February, 1832. And there's no age given, but this, I have my strong suspicions, is either Janet's husband or her son, and therefore the father of the 2 children. So those are my 2 favorite stones, 2 of my favorite stones in the old burying ground. Now I'll turn it over to the others to share some of their stories. And I think we're on mute.
Oh, okay, here we go. Sorry about that. So my first stone that I chose was the stone for 6 of the Lawson children. And I'm just going to read out this. This is the inscription, the epitaph that's on the bottom. "What once had virtue, grace, and wit lies moldering now beneath our feet. Poor mansions for such lovely guests, yet here they sweetly take their rest. Cold as their beds and dark as their rooms, yet angels watch around their tombs. Please," I think it's "they patrol," but "please they patrol nor sleep nor faint. They only watch their fellow saints, till the loud mansions of the skies relieves their guards and bids them rise." The stone for the Lawson children was carved in Massachusetts. You can't tell, but it's from the black and white photo, but it's a lightish gray slate stone. And their grandmother, Priscilla Shatford, is buried right next door. I think that's her stone that you can see on the left of it. And she died in 1781. The last child who's referenced on the stone died in 1784. So these stones were probably ordered at the same time. What's unique and sort of tragic about the Stone for the Lost and Children is that it's organized like an Excel spreadsheet. There are columns for months, day, and year that the children lived. The youngest lived just 14 days, I believe, and none of them made it to the age of 4 years old. That verse, I just discovered the source of that verse yesterday, and it is an adaptation of a poem by Samuel Bowden, which is perhaps ironically called Epitaph for an Only Child, but the words were changed to make this about many children. The carving up top is quite remarkable. This section of the gravestone, this arc at the top, is called the tympanum, and it depicts the angels that are watching over the tomb of the children. It relates directly to the verse, and you don't see that often. Like often, it seems as though people are picking out things from a catalog or something and mixing and matching iconography and verses. But here, it seems very clear to me that this depiction of these angels blowing trumpets and holding these quills are meant to reflect these angels watching around their tombs, right? And this really tells the story of mortality in childhood that was really common in early Halifax. And if the statistics from other parts of Canada at the time hold true, there's probably more than 1,000 children buried under the age of 10 who are buried in the old burying ground. So I chose the Tomb of the Lost and Children as a way to sort of reflect all of their stories. Interestingly, the Lawsons did have children who survived into adulthood. One of them founded the Bank of Nova Scotia, and these children listed on this gravestone are the great aunts and uncles of former Liberal leader Michael Ignatieff. So just a sort of funny coincidence. Next slide, please. I'm a layperson. I'm not an archaeologist or an anthropologist, and I'm just a storyteller. And I love the story of this stone. This is the stone of James Bossum, and the inscription reads, "Sacred to the memory of James, son of James and Catherine Bossum, who was willfully murdered on the morning of the 8th of August, 1839 by Smith D. Clark in the 23rd year of his life." Vanessa mentioned earlier, it's rare to see the cause of death on a gravestone. It's even rarer to see the time of day it happened and who done it. The story of the Bossums is interesting. The Bossum family ran a pub called the Waterloo Tavern. It's sometimes described as a brothel, which is about where the Halifax Alehouse is today, if anyone's familiar with Brunswick Street in Halifax. And Brunswick Street in Halifax in the 19th century was a rough and tumble place full of brothels and taverns and grog shops. And Bossum ran with a group of tough guys, and they had an ongoing dispute with Smith D. Clark, who owned a grog shop, who owned like a liquor store, basically. And so on the early morning of the 8th of August, 1839, at about 6:25 in the morning, James Bossum went looking for Smith D. Clark, and he banged on the doors of his place, and Clark came out carrying 2 pistols. He fired one as a warning, and Bossum just laughed and sneered at that. And so Clark fired the second one right through Bossum's eye. And it didn't kill him right away, but it sure did eventually. And you can imagine like this sort of lively, rough part of town at 6:25 in the morning, somebody's firing off a pistol. Everybody saw it happen. And so Clark was convicted of the charge. The charge is willful murder. That's the way that it was worded at the time, and that's why it says it like that on the gravestone. And that carried a sentence of death. But he never hanged. He never hanged for it. And the reason is that, you know, it took into 1840 for it to happen, and to celebrate the marriage of Prince Albert and Queen Victoria, which took place February 10th, 1840, the Queen issued royal pardons to criminals all across the Commonwealth. And Smith v. Clark's family was well connected, and they were able to get him one of these pardons. So despite being convicted of the charge of willful murder, he was set free and never seen again. Some people say he moved to Boston. Some people say that Boston's family killed him and buried him underneath the Waterloo Tavern. But either way, they made sure that nobody, even in 2024, would forget the crime and the murderer by carving his name into stone. And here it sits in the old burying ground in downtown Halifax.
So I just chose 2 stones. I don't have stories to go along with them. I was more interested in kind of the epitaphs that were on the stones, as well as the iconography that was on the top. So this stone here for Nathaniel Pierce, I came across it back in 2018. So I was in Dr. Fowler's public archaeology course while we were doing the mapping and everything that Vanessa spoke about of the cemetery. My friend and I were crawling around, and all of a sudden we just looked up, and this stone was in one of our sections. And it's just so striking. It's almost 3D, the way that the skull is carved and the bones going across underneath. I've not seen in my time walking around the old burying ground many examples of this kind of carving, just like the early style of the memento mori, the reminder of death. This is a very like prominent reminder. There was one other stone, John Connors, I believe that's actually quite close to Nathaniel's stone, that has kind of a similar style, but not carved quite the same. This one has just always stood out to me as I've walked around. So it says on it, here lies interred the body of Nathaniel Pierce, who departed this life January 26, 1755, age 70. Also, Mary, aged 22 months, and Abigail, aged 5 months, 14 days, 2 of his grandchildren. So I don't know a whole lot about Nathaniel, but of course, you know, you are getting a sense of that he has some grandchildren that are buried there with him. And this is just a really nice example of some of the earlier stones that are in the old burying ground. And this one, just the epitaph is so interesting on it. So we have sacred to the memory of Herbert Maynard, who departed this life on the 30th day of November, 1816, at the innocent and interesting age of 4 years, 8 months, and 8 days. And just kind of in contrast to Craig's example of the Lawson family stone, of course, you're going to have parents putting this stone up for this individual that died. This representation of child mortality, of course, that we're seeing in the 18th and 19th century, but just the choice of wording of the innocent and interesting age. And I tried to do a little bit of research into maybe if this ties in with any sort of common things that might have been on stones at the time, or if it's something to do with the time period, or just something with children and the, you know, being so young when they die. And I've not come across anything explaining kind of what this significance of this is. So if anyone has any ideas on what maybe this innocent and interesting age might be, please let me know, because it's definitely something that's always stuck with me as I've gone around the old burying ground. And that's it for us. And we just want to say thank you so much for having us. And we're so passionate about this site and having the ability to talk about it. And we look forward to answering any questions that you might have.
And I just
That's
want to say
great,
thank you
thanks.
again to the co-presenters on this and co-collaborators and co-conspirators. Always good to, you know, work with you all. And if there's any questions, we would be happy to answer.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That was great. The black and white photos of the memorials are striking for sure. So really great
Yes.
presentation. Thanks a lot. So if folks have questions, feel free to put your hand up or feel free to type them right into the chat and I'll try and catch them and relay them here. While folks are gathering, so availability of recording, we should have it up within a week or so. I'm probably going to stop the recording now, but that'll be up on our YouTube channel. Just search for Nova Scotia Archaeology Society. Natalie asks, can you speak a bit on about the conservation efforts at the old burying grounds? Not directed to anyone specifically.
Who wants to take that one?
I think you're up,
I don't see
Vanessa.
I don't see Adeena or Craig coming off mute. I was having trouble when I put myself on mute when I was trying not to interrupt people with my phone ringing. I wasn't able to get back, I wasn't able to unmute myself. I don't know if that's a feature of Zoom.
Right. Yeah, so if there is anything that if you're having issues, just post in here and we'll get you unmuted.
Just basically about the conservation efforts. I mean, it's an ongoing issue with a site of this age that those walls in particular need attention. The south wall is, now completely restored and looks great, but there's other projects within the old burying ground that are larger and smaller. And certainly when we see storm damage, for example, post-tropical storm Dorian and Lee, branches down, some of them affected some of the standing monuments in terms of falling and breaking, some of them that needed to be repaired. Anything else you want to throw in, either Adeena or Craig?
Oh,
I
you
think
muted Craig.
someone needs to unmute Craig.
Yeah,
Yes.
there we go.
I'm unmuted now.
Okay.
Sorry, and it was about the restoration efforts. The one thing that I wanted to mention earlier is that at some point in the 20th century, there has been unfortunately the stones have been organized to facilitate landscaping more easily. Like at one point, they decided it was important to be able to mow the lawn in rows. So it's not a restoration effort, but it's certainly an intervention that happened where a lot of the stones been organized into rows, and you can see sometimes where a headstone is next to a footstone, or a headstone and footstone or that belong to the same person are in completely different rows. So that's another intervention that's taken place.
Robin has a question about the Black and Indigenous burials. Is there any idea of where they may be within the site, or is there no information on that? Robin knows that Black burials were often segregated to a corner in older colonial sites.
I can feel that a little bit. Todd, who is in the audience tonight, Todd Scott, has been going through the parish records, and that's the only way that we know about those burials. And some of that's new information to us, and so we're really appreciative of people who are doing that kind of work. But I don't know if Todd, you can just give me a yes or no. You didn't find anything in there that indicates sort of nothing about where they were buried.